She lost everything and still became the most powerful woman in the ancient world. This is the true story they never taught you. More than 2,000 years ago, along the banks of a river that gave life to an entire civilization, a kingdom stood at the edge of its final age. Egypt was ancient even then, older than memory itself, its temples already worn smooth by centuries of prayer, its pyramids already silent witnesses to forgotten kings. But a new power was rising far across the sea. Rome. Hungry, relentless, and growing stronger. With every conquest into this fragile world, a child was born who would carry the weight of an entire dynasty on her shoulders. Her name was Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies, heirs to the throne of the pharaohs. Though not one drop of Egyptian blood ran through their veins, they were Greek by birth, descendants of the generals of Alexander the Great. Yet they had ruled the Nile for nearly 3 centuries, wrapping themselves in the sacred robes of the pharaohs to keep their crown legitimate in the eyes of the people. Cleopatra was different from the moment she could speak. While her brothers played at war with wooden swords, she sat with scribes and scholars, learning languages no foreign queen had ever bothered to learn: Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic. She would be the first of her family in 300 years to speak the true language of the people she ruled. Even as a child, she understood something her ancestors never grasped. A crown means nothing if the people do not believe you belong to them. But knowledge was not the only lesson the palace taught her. Behind every golden door, she saw the truth of her family's legacy. Brothers who poisoned brothers, sisters who imprisoned sisters. In the house of the Ptolemies, love and betrayal wore the same face. And a throne was never a gift. It was a battlefield disguised in gold. When Cleopatra was still young, her father, King Ptolemy, made a choice that would shape her entire life. Fearing Rome's growing shadow over Egypt, he traveled across the sea to beg the Roman Senate for protection, leaving his kingdom and his children exposed to the wolves within his own court. In his absence, the vultures gathered. Advisors whispered in dark corners. Generals counted their loyalties like coins. And Cleopatra, barely more than a girl, watched every movement, every alliance, every betrayal, storing it away like a weapon she would one day need. When her father finally returned, broken but still king, he made his final decision. Upon his death, the throne would pass not to one heir, but to 2, Cleopatra and her younger brother. Barely a child himself, bound together as king and queen by law, and by an ancient tradition that demanded they also become husband and wife. It was not a marriage of love, it was a marriage of survival, meant to keep the crown within the bloodline and to keep the wolves at bay. But when the old king finally died, the peace did not last. Cleopatra took her place on the throne with confidence far beyond her years, ruling with an intelligence that unsettled the men around her. And that unsettled feeling had a name: fear. The advisors who had once served her father now surrounded her young brother king instead, filling his ears with poison, telling him that a woman's rule was an insult to the gods, that Egypt deserved a king who bowed to no queen. Slowly, quietly, a plot began to take shape in the shadows of the very palace where Cleopatra had once studied the art of survival. And this time the danger would not come from Rome. It would come from her own blood. The betrayal came swiftly, and it came without mercy. One by one, the advisers who had raised her brother turned the boy king against his own sister, filling the halls of the palace with accusations, painting Cleopatra as a threat to Egypt itself. And then, without warning, the guards who once protected her turned their spears the other way. She was stripped of her crown in a single brutal night, her name erased from the temple walls, her face removed from the coins that once bore her image. The Queen of Egypt became, overnight, an exile in her own kingdom. She fled the palace with nothing, no army, no gold, no throne, only the clothes on her back and a fire in her chest that refused to die. Out into the desert she went, into a world of scorching sand and merciless sun, where kings meant nothing and survival meant everything. For a lesser soul, this would have been the end of the story. A forgotten princess, swallowed by the sand, remembered only as a warning to other women who dared to rule. But Cleopatra was not built to disappear. In the silence of the desert, stripped of every title, every comfort, every certainty she had ever known, something inside her hardened into steel. She began to gather what allies she could find among the desert tribes, whispering promises of gold and glory to any warlord willing to march against her brother's throne. It would not be enough. Not yet, but far across the sea, a storm was gathering that would change everything. Rome's greatest general was sailing toward Egypt, chasing an enemy of his own, and Cleopatra understood, with the clarity of a woman who had lost everything, that her only path back to power ran directly through him. His name was Julius Caesar, and he was by then the most feared man in the known world. He had crushed armies across Gaul, crossed the Rubicon in open defiance of Rome's own laws, and plunged the Republic into civil war. Now he had chased his rival, the general Pompey, all the way to the shores of Egypt, arriving in Alexandria expecting a swift and simple victory. Instead, he found chaos. Pompey was already dead, murdered by Cleopatra's own brother in a desperate, foolish attempt to win Caesar's favor. It was a fatal miscalculation. Rather than gratitude, Caesar felt only disgust at the cowardice of the act, and in that disgust Cleopatra saw her opening. But there was a problem. Her brother's forces controlled the palace, the harbor, the entire city. A deposed queen could not simply walk through the front gates and ask a Roman general for help. She would never survive the attempt. So she devised a plan so bold, so dangerous, that no one in the palace could have predicted it. Under the cover of darkness, she had herself wrapped inside a large rolled carpet, smuggled past her brother's guards by a single loyal servant, carried through the heavily guarded streets of Alexandria, and delivered directly into the private chambers of Julius Caesar himself. When the carpet was finally unrolled at his feet, the most powerful man in the world found himself staring not at rugs or treasure, but at the exiled Queen of Egypt herself, dust-covered, breathless, and utterly fearless. In that single, impossible moment, everything changed. Caesar was captivated, not merely by her beauty, but by her audacity, her intelligence, her sheer refusal to accept defeat. Within days, Roman soldiers were fighting in the streets of Alexandria, not for Rome, but for Cleopatra's throne. The war that followed was brutal and swift. Roman legions clashed with Egyptian forces in the narrow streets and along the harbor of Alexandria, fires spreading through parts of the city as ships burned in the docks. In the chaos, one of the greatest tragedies in human history unfolded almost unnoticed. Flames from the naval battles spread toward the great library of Alexandria, the largest collection of human knowledge the ancient world had ever known, and countless scrolls, centuries of wisdom, science, and history were consumed by fire before anyone could stop it. It was a wound the world would carry for generations. Yet, amid the smoke and destruction, Cleopatra's fortune finally turned. Her brother's forces were crushed. The boy king who had once cast her out drowned attempting to flee across the Nile, his golden armor dragging him beneath the water. And Cleopatra, filthy from war but unbroken in spirit, was restored to the throne of Egypt, this time with Rome's most powerful generals standing firmly at her side. She was queen again, but she was no longer merely a queen. She had proven something no ruler of her family had proven in 300 years, that she could not be broken, exiled, or erased. In the months that followed, her bond with Caesar deepened beyond politics. She bore him a son, a boy she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, a living symbol of the alliance between Egypt and Rome. For a moment, it seemed as though the gods themselves had blessed her path. She traveled to Rome as a queen, paraded through its streets in extraordinary wealth, the whole city gathering to glimpse the woman who had captured the heart of their greatest general. But fate, as it so often does, was preparing its cruelest turn. On a spring day in Rome, in the halls of the very Senate Caesar had once bent to his will, a group of his own trusted men surrounded him and struck him down with their blades, ending his life in a pool of betrayal and blood. The news reached Cleopatra like a thunderclap. The man who had restored her crown, who had given her a son, who had made Rome and Egypt allies for the first time in generations, was gone. And with his death, everything she had built suddenly stood on the edge of collapse. She fled Rome in secret, returning to Egypt with her young son, uncertain whether Rome's new masters would honor any promise made by a dead man. For a time she ruled quietly, strengthening Egypt's wealth, rebuilding its army, watching from a careful distance as Rome tore itself apart once again in a new civil war between Caesar's former allies and his assassins. When the dust finally settled, power in Rome had split between two men, a calculating young heir named Octavian and a hardened, charismatic general named Mark Antony. And it was Antony who would soon sail toward Egypt, summoning Cleopatra to answer for her loyalties during the war. She could have arrived as a humbled subject, begging forgiveness. Instead, she chose spectacle. She sailed up the river on a golden barge with purple sails, surrounded by incense, music, and attendants dressed as gods, arriving not as a defeated queen, but as a living legend. Mark Antony, hardened by decades of warfare, found himself utterly disarmed. Within days the two were inseparable, bound not merely by politics, but by ambition, admiration, and a passion that would soon threaten to unravel the entire Roman world. What began as an alliance quickly became something far greater and far more dangerous. Cleopatra and Antony ruled together as though they were building a new empire of their own. one that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the east, blending Roman power with Egyptian majesty. She bore him children. He showered her kingdom with territory once ruled by Rome itself. To their allies it looked like the birth of a golden age. But back in Rome, Octavian watched with growing fury. He painted Antony not as a Roman general in love, but as a man seduced and corrupted by a foreign queen who dreamed of ruling Rome itself through him. It was a story Rome was eager to believe, fear of a woman's power dressed up as patriotism. Octavian turned the Senate against Antony, stripped him of his titles, and declared war, not against a fellow Roman, but against Cleopatra herself, the foreign queen accused of trying to steal the empire from within. The two sides met at Actium, in a naval battle that would decide the fate of the ancient world. Hundreds of warships clashed upon the open sea, fire and wreckage scattering across the waves under a sky thick with smoke. And in the middle of the battle, disaster struck. Cleopatra's fleet, sensing the tide turning against them, withdrew from the fight, and Antony, upon seeing her ships retreat, abandoned his own battle to follow her, leaving his forces leaderless in the heart of the fight. It was a decision that would cost them everything. Their combined forces were shattered. Their alliance, their empire, and their dream of a united East and West collapsed in a single devastating afternoon upon the sea. Defeat followed them back to Egypt like a shadow that would not lift. Octavian's forces advanced steadily, city after city falling before him, until at last his legions stood at the gates of Alexandria itself. Antony, once one of Rome's greatest generals, now found himself abandoned by his remaining soldiers, betrayed by allies, and cornered with no path to victory left. In despair, and believing false word that Cleopatra had already died, he fell upon his own sword, dying in her arms only moments later, when the truth reached him too late to matter. Cleopatra was now alone, the last defender of a dynasty 3 centuries old, facing the full weight of Rome's victorious army at her doorstep. Octavian offered her a choice: surrender and be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains as a conquered trophy, a symbol of Roman triumph for the crowds to mock. It was a fate she could not accept. Better, she decided, to die a queen than to live a captive. In the quiet of her chamber, surrounded by her most loyal attendants, she prepared herself with the same courage that had once carried her inside a rolled carpet into the chambers of Caesar himself. She dressed in her royal robes, took her crown, and by her own hand ended her life, refusing to give Rome the satisfaction of her surrender. With her death, the last pharaoh of Egypt passed into legend, and an ancient kingdom that had stood for 3,000 years, longer than any empire before or since, finally came to an end, swallowed not by time, but by the ambitions of Rome. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke into the chamber, they found her already gone. Her royal robes perfectly arranged, her crown still resting upon her head, as though she had chosen even her final image with the same precision she had used to rule an empire. Octavian, now the undisputed master of Rome, could not help but feel a strange, grudging respect for the woman who had denied him his greatest prize, a living queen to parade before the cheering crowds of Rome. Egypt, the last great kingdom of the ancient world, became a mere province of Rome, its temples still standing, its gods still worshipped, but its throne forever empty. And yet something curious happened in the centuries that followed. While Rome itself eventually crumbled into ruin, buried beneath the weight of its own ambitions, Cleopatra's name only grew stronger, passed from storyteller to storyteller, transformed again and again into legend. She became the symbol of a woman who refused to be erased by men who believed a queen could never truly rule. She became proof that intelligence, courage, and sheer force of will could shake empires built by armies far greater than her own. Historians would argue for centuries about her true motives. Was she a schemer who used love as a weapon, or a queen who fought with every tool available to protect her people from a hungry empire that intended to consume them regardless? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps in the end that was exactly what made her impossible to forget. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, her story refuses to fade. Poets wrote of her beauty, playwrights wrote of her passion, historians argued over her politics, but beneath every version of the tale lies the same undeniable truth. She was a young woman who lost her throne before she had barely learned to rule it, who was cast into a desert with nothing, and who clawed her way back not once but twice against forces far more powerful than herself. She spoke the language of her own people when no ruler before her had bothered to learn it. She built alliances with the two most powerful men Rome had ever produced, not through weakness, but through intelligence, charm, and a fearlessness that unsettled an empire built entirely by men. In the end, Rome conquered her kingdom, but it never truly conquered her. She chose the manner of her own death, denying her enemies their final victory, and in doing so, she transformed defeat itself into one final, unforgettable act of defiance. Perhaps that is why, across every retelling, every stage, every screen, her name continues to echo through history long after the empire that defeated her turned to dust and ruin. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, who refused, until her final breath, to kneel. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more content just like it, and thank you for watching.